Okay, well, good evening once again. This is In Conservation with. It's January 2021, would you believe? We've been doing this whole thing for about 10 months now, so it's a long time. I'd like to, before we even start, to thank our sponsor, Leica Sport Optics, for paying for the whole Zoom experience, and also thank all you Zoomers for being here tonight. My guest tonight is a lady that I only kind of came across, I think, a week and a half ago, but it was a sudden samba. It's like, oh my Lord, I must talk to her. I must get her to talk to us on In Conservation. And I'm so happy that Elle decided to say yes to come along and speak to us. So thank you very much, Elle, for joining us tonight and sparing your time to talk to us about taxidermy.
Pleasure.
Now, before we get into the taxidermy things, let's talk about you, because we need to kind of work out, because I'm sure many people, apart from your what's your
grandmother,
your grandmother. I'm sure apart from your grandmother, not many of us don't actually know too much about you. So it'd be great to learn about you. According to your official biog, you are a professional bird taxidermist and educator from the UK. You live just outside London. You only work with animals that die of natural causes, and that's one thing we must stress straight away, actually. You've been featured across many mainstream news outlets worldwide for your work. You're a keen birder and conservationist. You see your work as a contribution towards taxonomy and the preservation of our species. You're devoted to protecting wildlife through all that you do, and you see your work as an essential contribution to conservation through education that can lead to a tangible outreach. You also have a very successful podcast called Specimens, which I'd like to talk to you about. It's your attempt to open a dialogue about our planet and ways we can help to protect it, and also making space for underrepresented and misunderstood roles within science, with an emphasis on roles centering around conservation and preservation. So that's really very interesting. And as I said, I only came across you a week and a half ago. I put something on my Instagram, and I looked at your work, and I thought it was great. And I've always had a fascination personally with taxidermy. But anyway, we'll get onto that shortly. Firstly, Elle, how are you? How are you dealing with lockdown and that kind of thing? How are you doing?
Yes, I'm really well, thank you. I'm actually really fortunate because I work for myself and I have my own studio. So I've been very lucky that I'm still able to work throughout all of this. I was pretty much geared up for self-isolation before it became popular, because as a taxidermist, there aren't that many of us and we typically work on our own. So yeah, I was isolating long before it was cool. I work alone. I don't have it.
When you say you work alone, you sound like a spy or something.
I know. Well, as soon as it comes out of my mouth, I sort of think it just sounds so weird, but for me, it's second nature. I don't think twice about it. I have a studio on a farm, so I've just been going there and back, and various outbuildings. So I feel part of the environment, and it's definitely a really good environment to be working. You're surrounding yourself with nature and feeling inspired by the environment. I don't think it would work quite as well if I was in more of a kind of built up environment. So it's nice to be able to look out the window and see, fields, and cows and whatnot, and hear the bird song. And that's something that I really take a lot from, because being alone all the time, it is difficult, especially, as a young person who likes to talk to people. It can be difficult. You're on your own for X amount of hours a day. So it's nice to have, the surrounding sounds of the animals, etc.
That's good. Now let's go back to the even younger Elle. How did you actually get your first kind of introduction to the natural world? I mean, what did you have a mentor? Did you have someone that kind of showed you stuff, or were you born interested?
It's funny because, no disrespect to my family who are in this group, but I don't remember any particularly iconic moments to do with wildlife that was shaped through my parents or sort of my family generally, I felt as though when I was growing up, I liked nature, but perhaps it was uncool to like nature. So it was something that I felt perhaps I wasn't properly giving time to. I was maybe suppressing it. And I really loved biology. I loved animals, but I wasn't a natural scientist. I was always very creative. So this obviously hindered any desire to follow any kind of academic conservation, biology, marine biologist. There were so many dreams of animal-based jobs that I thought about, but it just never really transpired for me. It was always that I was more creative. And I loved animals. I mean, always, there's loads of photos of me as a child, you know, whether it was petting guinea pigs at a kind of, you know, local little zoo, or it was, I actually have a funny story about the first time I went on a dolphin cruise. I was fortunate enough to be taken to Florida, and I'm on this boat and I'm actually crying because I'm so overwhelmed with the dolphins. And, you know, my parents are saying, come out onto the, you know, wherever on the deck where everybody is and come and enjoy them. And I think it was at that moment that I had this overwhelming emotion for animals that I couldn't really verbalize at the time. It was almost as though I felt this deep-rooted connection, or this kind of desire to do something with animals, but perhaps I wasn't really aware of it at the time because I was young. So I remember that being quite a funny memory. But no, it was very organic, my progression towards taxidermy. I didn't have any at home, don't really remember going to museums and having a kind of particularly transformative moment. It was all just a very organic kind of feeding into this curiosity that I had, and allowing myself to indulge that curiosity as well, and sort of saying, okay, maybe my classmates don't think it's cool, but I do, and perhaps I can kind of take it somewhere.
Okay, it's interesting because we did have a fellow taxidermist on at the end of the first season last year, Polly Morgan, who I know you know, or know of at least.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because when I think of people involved in taxidermy, and I think she kind of emphasized that for me, really. You sometimes you feel these people, or people like yourselves, are kind of in tune to something that we're not. She used to tell me that she used to, like, when she stroked her dog, she wasn't really stroking it. She was feeling the structure of the animal.
Yeah, yeah. And it's funny because we do that now. So I think once you become a taxidermist, or you start to become absorbed in looking at animals in this way, seeing them as an anatomical subject, it does definitely change the way that you see animals. It doesn't make you love them any less, but I think your intrigue shifts from emotional to academic, because although I do adore animals, it's definitely more about behavior or ecology or conservation. It's not so much about the projection of emotion, which I think a lot of non-taxidermists or just general members of the public might have towards their animals, because they're not seeing them as anatomical subjects without, you know, skins on and whatever.
Yeah, because just to skip ahead, I know we're going to talk about this in a minute, but I did read, or I can't remember what I saw it on your site. That's right. I looked at your website. The fine website, by the way, guys. I'm sure Maya will put up the details of it. But you talked about, you had a Q&A bit at the end where people ask questions, and one question was, can you basically do some taxidermy on my pet? And I kind of found it weird, that concept of having your dog, or, you know, your cat in the corner of the room looking at you for eternity. You know, it's just, I don't understand the mentality of that.
I think memorial taxidermy is becoming more popular. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have the entire animal mounted, just a keepsake. So when a dog or a cat passes away, sometimes it's in a moment where it's very brief. You only have minutes to say goodbye to your loved one, and you haven't been given other options, and it's very quick, and then the carcass gets taken away, and it's kind of all this detachment. And actually, some people find that when their beloved is gone, they actually wish they had, I don't know, you know, a locket of their fur, or perhaps even something a little bit more tangible, you know, a paw or something, or a paw embedded in cement to leave an impression, or whatever it is. So it's nice to be able to give people the option to actually think about it while their beloved is still alive. So I'm not saying, you know, put me on your speed dial in case, you know, your pet drops down, but it gets people talking about what their wishes would be if hypothetically their animal was to die. And it gets people to open the dialogue about death generally, which is something that both human and animal, I think people find a difficult conversation. Yeah. So it's just, again, just trying to enter that dialogue and make people a little bit more in tune with their wishes and perhaps keepsakes and things like that. But yeah, the idea of having your dog mounted fully is something that might feel a bit abstract, because also a taxidermist is just creating a still rigid model. So it's only going to have, this is going to sound a bit crass, but I mean, we're in conversation with a taxidermist. So you're only going to have the skin of your beloved. So actually it loses so much of what it was when it was alive. It just becomes a model, and the skin just becomes a material. So it's not going to be what you think it might be. And that's why I don't really do domestic animals, because there is that emotion that we project. I talked about projecting emotion. A taxidermist can't create that. We strive for likeness, but you can't put the glimmer in the eye. You can't put, the way that it would look at you when it was looking for snacks or whatever. You just can't do that. It's just a rigid model.
Yeah. And the other thing is, let's get this out of the way, elephant in the room and all that sort of stuff. Sometimes when you think of taxidermy, before I met Polly Morgan, a few years ago, I thought of taxidermy as stuffed animals. Mm-hmm. And you don't, is a term, when someone says stuff to you, stuffed animals, does that make you go rigid at the thought, or is it something, do you find it offensive, or is that a term that people sort of say to you when they're talking about animals being, what is the correct term? I'm sort of pussyfooting around trying to find out what is the correct term on all this. What's the PC term?
So as taxidermists, we use the term mounted. So if something is mounted, the skin is mounted onto an anatomically accurate model that we've made. It can be model making. Stuffed is quite archaic because it comes out of study skins, which were the skins that were brought back from abroad back in the day when they didn't have photographs, etc., that were literally just stuffed with cotton or whatever to give that kind of example of that species. And then they were tucked away in drawers. You would have seen them in museums. Whereas we are not really stuffing it. We're actually creating a model that stands and has armature and can actually have center of gravity and stuff. So it's just that it's a different thing underneath. There is some soft stuffing, which is kind of loose plush in some certain areas to build up muscle distribution, but it's not stuffing in the way that you, but it's not an offensive term. It's just an old-fashioned term. It just needs updating.
Yeah, maybe I'm showing my age. Now, before you tell us about what you do and how you do it, let me ask you, and again, delicately, what was the first thing you mounted?
So I started doing taxidermy when I was at university. I'm self-taught in that manner. I was doing a fine art and sculpture degree, and I had this curiosity for biology. I mentioned that I was interested in biology, and I had this love for animals. It was kind of a bit of a marriage of the interest in biology, interest in science, interest in art, interest in sculpture. It was just a kind of amalgamation of all of the above. I was very limited with the specimens that I could obtain because I'm, at university, and I went down to the local pet shop and I said, this is going to sound a little bit odd, but would you please keep anything that passes? So there was a guinea pig, there was a domestic rabbit, and a couple of snakes, which I refused to work on because I don't like snakes. I like them from afar, but I didn't want to work on them. And I think it was if I remember correctly, it was the guinea pig. I actually left that guinea pig under the bed when I left my halls of residence, my house, because my landlord wasn't a very nice person.
That's funny. Okay, well, I'm sure we're all kind of dying to know how you do your work. And do you see your work as art? Do you see your work as sort of exemplifying nature? How do you view yourself? Are you an artist or a technician?
I don't think that you can be one without the other. I think they're both synonymous. I would say that a taxidermist has to be a sculptor because you have to have artistic flair to be able to create the model again. Anybody can skin an animal. It's not rocket science. Some people will do it with more holes, but it's really not difficult. And I'm sure people who do prepare, their own meat might have broken down or skinned an animal before. That's not difficult. But the bit that's difficult is after you've skinned an animal, there is the processing of the skins. So that's kind of a little bit of chemistry. You have to make sure that you're preserving your skins properly. And that's the kind of chemistry biology stage. And then the art stage at the end. To be honest, I think you have to be all of those. I don't think you could be one and not exist as another. I think that sculpture, having a brain that allows you to visualize something 3D is important. I don't think everybody could do it, because you have to have, a sculptor has to have a certain way of looking at the world, whether that's seeing a block and being able to carve away, or seeing nothing and being able to build up. I think you need that kind of forward thinking and the artistic manner of reading the world to be able to be a taxidermist, paired with all the other stuff, obviously.
Well, in the week and a half that I've known you, and I'm sure this is going to be the first week and a half for the rest of our lives, hopefully, I really thought that your work was very lifelike, because you think of taxidermy, and I know things have changed obviously now, but when I think of taxidermy, before I met, as I said, Polly Morgan, I thought of it as stuffy, kind of dusty things in the case, which weren't even lifelike in terms of the posture, and they become sort of bald and all that sort of stuff. But when I looked at your work on your webpage, on your website, I remember looking at the great tit, for example, and it was like a great tit standing on a branch. I mean, even with the glow in its eye. Now the difference now is the fact that you've got nice eyes to put into things as opposed to what they did in the past.
Yeah.
So no, it's really, really good work, and I'm sure, as like the rest of the Zoomers here, are really keen to learn how, in terms of how do you do your thing?
Well, I've brought lots of examples, so if now's the time, I can.
Now is the time.
Process.
Now is the time.
Okay, like I say at the beginning, you are speaking to a taxidermist, so I imagine this is not going to come as a surprise, but I am going to show a couple of the parts of the process, and that does include obviously a skin and I've chosen a tiny bird, so it won't be too offensive, hopefully. But first of all, what we do is when we get the specimen raw, obviously, still intact, it's coming from various places. It's either coming, well, I only use animals that die of natural causes. I don't know if you want me to go into that a little bit now.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure we all found dead birds now and again. I remember I found a great tit outside the house once, and I put it in the freezer, and also a blackbird, for the very moment I might meet someone like you, and unfortunately I didn't, so it went to waste. But when you find dead creatures, I suppose the etiquette is put it in a plastic bag or a sealable bag and put it in the freezer. Is that what it is?
Precisely, yeah. You want quite a high, quite a thick bag, plastic bag, sealed, so it's airtight, a zippy Ziploc. I don't know what people in other countries might call it. Yeah, just a snappy bag. Date it, label it, and put it somewhere safe so it doesn't get crushed, especially if it's something small. That's the thing, is getting the specimens in the freezer as quickly as possible. It's very easy to look at a specimen and think that it's perfect for taxidermy, but 9 times out of 10, which is a massive percentage, they're actually not appropriate because they're either too far in the stages of decomposition, or perhaps they were actually attacked, so there's damage. Maybe I don't know, if it was a window strike and it shattered its skull, this skull is then pierced through the skin and it's actually torn the face, which is such a valuable part of any mount. So it's actually not suitable, but it might look pristine in its kind of overall appearance. So I tell people how to check their specimens when they find them, make sure they're suitable for taxidermy. And then once they are, they can be transported through the postal service. So we normally send things frozen delivery, next day delivery, and things, if they're wrapped properly, well insulated, will come to the taxidermist to be ready to go. I either would pop it back in the freezer if I'm not going to work on it that day, or if it's sort of partly thawed and ready to go and I have time to do it, I will skin it as soon as it arrives. Obviously taking precautions, because I know that there's quite a lot of avian, so I only work on birds, there's quite a lot of avian diseases that can be transferred. So taking precautions, wearing gloves, etc. We use pretty much surgical tools, so scalpels, forceps, tweezers, etc. And we are extracting the skin from the carcass. So I'm going to show you, for those who don't want to see, you can look away. So I've chosen a tiny bird, so hopefully it won't offend too many people. But this is, put it over here so you can see, the inside of a Goudian finch. So just a beautiful coloured finch, which I'm going to show you mounted in a sec. And you can see the neck and the tongue, if you can see that.
Yeah.
And then it's got its crop, which is filled with seeds. Bless it, it was a captive bird. So, and that essentially is how you want to skin things. You want to take it out completely intact. So you can see that everything is kind of being held in its entity. It's not loose and abdomen's like, you know, dripping out and whatever. So it's pretty well contained. That way you have a really clear anatomical reference to work off of. So I'm going to pop that away. When I've taken the carcass out, what you're left with is the skin. So you can see here, this is another Goudian finch. You've got the leg bones, got the wing bones. I've obviously cleaned this. And then we keep the skull attached to the skin. So that's ready to go. That would be washed. You can see I've taken all the meat off. Can you see that properly?
Yeah, what's in its mouth?
No, that's the skull attached to the inside of the face. If you take the entire skull out, then the face will collapse.
Oh,
so that the skin would roll back over.
Oh,
Sorry,
right.
it's so small it's hard to see, but I didn't want to offend people with a great big hawk or something. Thought that might be a bit much. So we have this skin, and this will be preserved. Obviously, a skin like this is so small and so brittle that it's going to dry out pretty quickly. So you want to be keeping everything really cool. We often work on refrigerated marble slabs or granite slabs or something with the small birds, because they are prone to bacterial growth and slipping, which is the term where feathers and fur can sort of come out. So yeah, once you get to that stage, you need to be washing and preserving the skins. And this is a process that it varies depending on what specimen you're working on. So with the mammals, not that I work on them, but just to give you some comparison, you want to be pickling the skins, salting the skins, and really putting them through quite a thorough process of tanning or tanning the hide. With something as small as this, it's so fragile, it doesn't need to be tanned in the same way, because the skin, it's not as thick, it doesn't have as many enzymes to break down. So the organic material can be changed in quite a simple kind of brush on tan. It doesn't need to go through the whole process. So we just do soaks, various soaks. You can soak it in various alcohol solutions. You can buy chemically built compounds that you can pour into water and preserve them that way. You can salt them. I always do a dual preservative because I'm paranoid and I would like for my taxidermy to outlive me. So I always do kind of a little bit more than perhaps one should, just to ensure the longevity of the specimens. But that's only because I'm coming so much from the angle of legacy and conservation in everything that I do, that it would sort of feel a bit ironic if I wasn't trying to preserve them in the best way possible, because taxidermy can survive for hundreds of years if looked after properly and if preserved properly. So I do sort of go for it. Back to the process, once you've preserved it, you then need to be making your model. And I'm going to show you a maquette that I made. This is a maquette of a jay bird. So we have the beautiful jays in this country with a dash of blue. And it's probably looks a bit odd, but what I've used here is something called balsa wood. And we're basically taking an anatomical measurement from our carcass and building up a body form. So this is one that has not been fully completed, but you can see I've got the basic structure in place. Yeah. So then you would carve away to create your body form. And then all of these other armatures are where the wings would go. I don't know if you can see that.
So what's that made of again? Did you say balsa wood?
Balsa wood, yeah, model making wood.
Okay.
So really easy to find. So that's one method of doing it. And you can see you've got the neck here, and you can just see this is really a really good way of visualizing what sits underneath the skin. Because I think a lot of people think that you keep lots of the kind of perhaps more of the insides, maybe the rib cage and things, but you just don't. We just don't do that. We don't need to do an articulation, and articulation is a whole other science in itself as well. So taxidermists don't always have time to be articulating things as well, because you have to go through maceration and a whole host of other things. So most taxidermists won't fully articulate a specimen and then put the skin back over. You can also use wood wool. So this is a wood wool form. This is quite an old-fashioned method. This was used predominantly and sort of historically more by museum taxidermists. And it's basically using wood wool, which is like a sort of string wood. Do you know it? It's used in hampers and packaging. And you can bind it together to create this really like dense shape. And obviously it needs to be really, really firm. Otherwise you won't be able to penetrate wires through it. And therefore the specimen won't stand. So that's another way you can do it. And then there's just 2 more ways. You can use blue foam, insulation foam, which you can carve by hand. So it's a method I particularly like because it's super easy to work with. It's very soft and gives a really beautiful shape underneath the skin. And then finally, you can buy commercial forms. So this is just brought from the internet. So they come in different shapes and sizes. This is a yellow-sided conure. This one doesn't have a thing, but looking at it, it could be a
so they're pre-shaped. They're pre-shaped to particular types of birds.
Exactly, but they are generic. So that's the only downside of using commercial forms is because they're generic, you'll need to modify them. So I much prefer to make everything from scratch. So I'm working to the exact measurements that I have rather than buying a generic size and then adapting it to my carcass and making it the appropriate size. The reason these exist is some commercial taxidermists are churning out so much work so quickly that they don't have time to make their forms. And it's kind of like oh, it will do. Or perhaps the reason that they would do something like this is if they're a beginner and they want to really work on one element of the process because there's a lot of things to nail down. So they want to maybe work on the preserving side of things, which takes a while to understand, or they want to work on the skinning and they don't want to then have to stop and keep practicing on this. So they'll use this in the beginning to get their confidence up. Yeah. And then when they feel that they've mastered some of the other elements, they'll start making this from scratch. So these are great for beginners. So yeah, and then you would assemble the whole thing together, and then you would get, I don't know which one to show you, and then you would get a.
So just take me back for a second now. If you you get a goldfinch, a dead goldfinch, you get out the freezer. What do? You wait till it thaws, till it's soft, or how?
So you don't thaw it 100%. We thaw to about 80% because we want to try and keep everything as cold as possible. We just want to get a little bit of movement in the skin so we can extract it from the carcass. If you're working on things that are like fully room temperature, you're running the risk of bacterial growth and also speeding up the process of taxidermy, which essentially is extract moisture and allow it to dry. The skin can go so brittle, it can go like papyrus paper. So you want to make sure you're trying to keep slow everything down by keeping it cool. So then you would skin it once it's about 80% thawed, and then you go through the process of preserving and making your model. But you can pop the skin back in the freezer when you're not working on it. So obviously you want a clean space. So you do all the sort of like dirty work to begin with. Then you could clean up, put your skin back in the freezer, and then you could work from some sketches from your measurements, and then do all the sort of like model making stuff. And then you would harmoniously put the 2 together. So
when you're talking about skinning, I want to kind of work this out in my mind. So do you need to be a biology student to actually do this, or where do you cut from the abdomen across the belly? I mean, how does it work?
Yeah, so we make an incision that really depends on how the specimen is going to be posed, rather than the other way around. So you have to have an idea of what you want at the end in order to inform what you do at the beginning. So 99% of the time with a bird, you would cut down its belly. You obviously don't want to penetrate the abdomen beneath, because then you'll end up with intestines and it would just be messy, especially if you're a beginner. It makes it really confusing if you think you're looking at something, but it's not that, it's something else because you've made a mistake. It can be a little bit jarring. So you're making an incision that usually goes from somewhere in the middle of the breast all the way down the breastbone, it depends how far you want to take it, but some people go right down to the vent, and others can stop sort of like a third of the way up. And then that's how we start to create these pockets and start to skin with the scalpel around the carcass to extract that little carcass that I showed you in one piece, detaching at the legs. So you detach, at top of the femur, and that way you can keep the leg bones attached to the skin, so you can use them in informing your armature when you recreate. They're tiny. I mean, this is a tiny bird, so it's quite hard to see.
And so, okay, you get that far. Because I'm just trying to, because the thing is, I mean, I'm now realizing that taxidermy is not for everyone, obviously, because I think you need to have a little bit of a stomach for this, especially if you are doing a big bird, or I mean, even if you're doing something like the bird behind me, you kind of see it as a lovely bird in your garden, and there it is, flat out dead on your table, and you got to cut it open. Going back to the goldfinch you showed us,
Yes.
how do you kind of mount it onto? How do you mount it onto the actual shape you made, and then put it onto that bit of stick?
So, because I've kept the bones attached to the skin, I can use them to help me recreate the internal structure. So the bones will line up with this wire, which will go inside the body form. And then when we put the skin back over it, it's all connected. The wires we leave trailing out of the feet so that we can then pop the wires into our chosen branch or perch or whatever. And that way as well, it makes it easy because you can anchor it to something, so it's not going to tip forward or be wobbly. I mean, it shouldn't be wobbly ever anyway, but that way it gives it kind of a really robust shape. So like this is, I mean, it's pretty, he's not going anywhere. So that way it's safe to transport. It means that you're probably looking at more durability just in the long term of having taxidermy specimens. And also it keeps it, you know, how it should look. If they're movable and, you know, you have maybe perhaps children playing with it, then you might actually compromise the appearance and the bird won't look accurate or lifelike anymore. So we want to try and keep it looking that way forever.
And do you prepare your stuff in cases, or is it like what that goldfinch is? I mean, once you've bought something from you, how do you maintain it?
It's completely up to the client. If the client wants it in a dome or a case, they can totally have that, and that's absolute preference. But you can have taxidermy uncased, and I'd say about 75% of the work that I sell is uncased. I sort of have that kind of minimalistic style. Because taxidermy can survive for so long, and because I am sort of quite hot on the preservative, I am confident that with the right guidance, the client just needs to know how to sort of look after it. It's not particularly laborious. It just needs to be checked regularly, and you can use an antiquity spray, sort of a pesticide or whatever. But it's really going to stay as it is. The only outside risk, the vulnerability, would be moth. And obviously a taxidermist can't legislate for that in a client's home. So that's got to be down to the client. So I provide an aftercare manual when I sell a piece of work, and it basically educates the client on how to look after taxidermy, things that they can use, chemicals they can use that are safe around the home, safe for adults, safe for children, safe for animals, and also what taxidermy can do if looked after properly. You know, what it can, how long it can live, you know, be passed down for generations and generations. I was never passed, well, I actually have a funny story. My grandmother had a mink stole, and I didn't like it when I was younger, which is funny because if you look at where I am now. But my older cousin Adam, he used to torment me with it, and I used to scream and cry. But it just goes to show that that specimen, which was well looked after, had survived, and it probably is, I mean, it might be in a charity shop or somewhere now. I don't think my grandma still has it, but these things can be worn. They can actually physically be worn and not be damaged. So that's the reason I told the story is, you know, if it's looked after properly, despite its purpose, it can survive. Animal skins, you know, think of fur coats. So it's just knowing how to look after them. And I think that's something that people are a little bit scared of. And then in that case, have a case, and that way it will protect it and you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah. At this point, actually, one of the Zoomers, a regular Zoomer, Chris Eek, has a question. So Chris, do you want to come on and ask your question, if that's possible?
Yeah, hi there. Hi, everybody. Hi.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, David. Just wondering, like, your goldfinch is absolutely fantastic. And I'm sort of wondering, are you self-taught, or did you learn at, I don't know, do they do university courses and that type of thing? And also, how long did it take you to become like a professional?
Yeah.
Is it worth, please?
Absolutely, yeah. Lovely to meet you. Thank you for the question. I started teaching myself when I was at university because I was doing this fine art and sculpture course, and I wanted to do something with animals, but I didn't know what specifically. Somebody suggested I try taxidermy because it had the anatomical interest with the sculpture. So I did that, and I was getting these specimens from the pet store, and I was kind of chipping away in the studio, much to my peers' disgust. I think they all thought I was an absolute lunatic. They gave me a wide berth, it's fair to say. And that I just kind of plugged away for about 3 years. And then once I graduated, I had my degree show, and it was all taxidermy. Off the back of that, I started working for another taxidermist completely by chance. I sort of Googled if there were any taxidermy jobs, because I had been doing it for so long. I sort of felt as though I was too far along in that. And after 3 years, you get to a level where perhaps you're not ready to sell publicly, but you've improved massively. And I felt as though I could actually make something of it, and I loved it. I felt as though it was a really wonderful practice. So that's where I sort of took it. And I have since done some short courses. I did a 2-day course with a bird taxidermist in Yorkshire, just to try and learn from other people and find out different ways and methods. When you are self-taught, it's very difficult because the internet is such a big place and there's so much conflicting information. So it's nice to be able to go to someone and say, okay, this is your method. I'm gonna learn it, see if I like it. Okay, I'm gonna take that away. It might take a few elements from it, but might not stick to it 100%. Then learn from somebody else. So I have done a couple of professional courses, but as it stands, it's just been a evolution of kind of working away independently over a period of, I've been doing taxidermy 7 years now. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
No, great. So like say the taxidermists you've learned from as well, were they for different experiences from what you'd self learned, or were you sort of on the right lines, or was it a bit like, oh well, there's sort of like a lot of extra things I need to know here? Or
no, it was definitely just learning a little bit extra on top of what. So I sort of had like a foundation of knowledge, and there were things that I found difficult. So wiring the wings, for example, I wasn't sure that I was doing it right. So to go to a bird taxidermist with 40 years of experience who taught classes, it just gave me the kind of reassurance and the confirmation that I was doing it correctly. And it just kind of reaffirmed that part of the process. I did do a short mammal class with a gentleman actually in Canada who is a taxidermist. And as somebody who was doing a little bit of mammals and doing a little bit of birds, not really, it kind of cemented to me that I just wanted to do birds. So that was helpful because it helped for me to understand that I didn't really like the chemistry side of the preserving and tanning the hides. It's a lot more, a lot of mammals are enormous, so you need a lot of strength physically and mentally. So that, again, learning from other people kind of helped to inform what I decided to do today. So that was definitely helpful. And there was no sort of big shocks.
Great, that's good. Obviously on the right lines. Yeah. One of the just very quick question is, how long did it take you to sort of make the goldfinch that you just showed before?
Yeah, so I usually mount small birds in about 2.5 days. So I spend the first day skinning the specimen, cleaning the specimen, and washing the specimen. And then the following day, I will create the body and I will mount the specimen. And then the following morning, I will feather or groom. So you have sort of a small window of time before the taxidermy sort of dries out.
Yeah.
So that's about 2.5 days work. But then at the end of that drying time, about 2 weeks, you want to be doing finish work, which is, glossing the eyes, attaching it to a branch, smoothing off the branch, hiding the wires. So it's about 3.5 days work.
Oh, lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris, as well. Always a man with good questions. Just out of interest, Elle, have you got any other examples of your work with you there, apart from your goldfinch?
Yes. So I've got a Goudian because I thought that would make sense if you saw it skinned. It wasn't very nice. So I thought I'd show you a finished one. And I've actually got 2 examples. I've got one that's in its drying stage. So you can see, I don't know if you can see those pins that are sticking out of it. And there's a little bit of thread on its tail, if you can see that. And what we're doing there is basically pinning externally to keep everything in place the way that I want it. So it stays like that. I'll leave it like this for 2 weeks, and then I'll take everything out and it will stay firm and rigid. And then to show you a finished one, I tried to do the same pose, but might not be exactly the same. That's a finished one, so it's nice and clean. Everything's all kept together. Again, very robust. It's not going anywhere. And no wires, no pins. The eyes have been glossed. The legs have been painted. You can't see the wires. So it's all ready to go. So that's ready for kind of a commercial sale now. And there's a process of about 2.5 weeks between those two birds. So yeah, I mean, that's the same bird that I showed you skinned. So I'll have a third one to do.
Did you actually do you actually look at the birds live, or do you watch videos or go on YouTube to see what they're like in life to then sort of instruct you as to how to posture it?
Yes, and I'll answer that in 1 second. I've just seen someone says it looks like it's having acupuncture. They're actually acupuncture pins. So you were spot on because they're so delicate and they don't have big points. So I mean, it sounds they're not going to tear the skin and make great holes. So they actually are acupuncture pins. But I'm sorry, to answer your question, David. What was your question? Sorry.
The question was, do you watch to get the postures right? I mean, that Gordon Finch, for example, an Australian finch. I've not seen one in real life. I presume they act in similar ways to other finches, but do you actually watch that particular species or look at pictures to then guide you as to how the posture should be?
Definitely, 100%. That's the most important thing. And one of the things I said earlier was we usually have an idea of pose actually before we begin. And that's really important because you're working within parameters of nature. So it's not just a ceilingless craft. There are some rules and we have to kind of adhere to these parameters. So looking at animals in life, using reference images, using videos is absolutely crucial. Otherwise we stand no chance of giving it any likeness. So some birds pose differently. Some birds do funny things with their tails. You know, a kookaburra, when it lands on a branch, it always bobs its tail up and down. You know, little things like that. You have to have these behavioral understanding of animals in order to inform the pose, because it's a rigid pose and we want to give it a little bit of a sense of life. When you have that in your mind, it helps to transpose less of a kind of, okay, it's just a hard model. Actually, you're able to kind of maybe put a little bit of life back into it if you have an understanding of how it would be in life. If the tail's the right pose, right angle, you know, an owl or whatever, if its head is perhaps extended the way that they do, where they have their collar, you know, really visible, that other birds perhaps do not. Getting all those tiny little nuances in these birds can only come from observing them in life. And also it's really important not to just use one image, to have a whole host of different images from different poses, because we're not working 2D, it's 3D. So we need to be able to see it all the way around. And one of the things that's really useful is actually working in front of a mirror, not for vanity purposes, but just to see how your bird is matching up. Is it symmetrical? You know, some birds cross their wings. So magpies and crows, that they cross the back of their wing. You know, you need to be able to observe these little nuances, otherwise your animal will fall short of being lifelike.
Yeah, because that's where a lot of the old school taxidermists got it wrong. I mean, the dodo is a classic example, because you always see the dodo in a certain position, but in reality, apparently its posture is totally different. So I get what you're saying. On a technical note, how do you put the eyes in? I mean, I take it, you know, you had that bird that was inside out. So you kind of drag it back over its skull, and then do you buy these little special eyes for different types of birds? How does that work?
Yes, so all of the eyes are custom. So what that means is with their species specific. So for example, if I get a commission from a client and they say they want a rosebrain parakeet, and you know, they have very different eyes to a robin. They've got white eyes, well, white or black. And so you have to go onto your taxidermy supplier and you have to type in, you know, ringneck parakeet, and then it will come up and you have to find the diameter of the eye, and then you order it and you wait for it to come, and then you use the skull and you fill it with clay, and you check with the calipers that the bird is looking the right way. Obviously, if you just put them in sideways, it would look a bit odd. They have to sit at the correct angle so that the bird actually has symmetry, but also is looking at something. If one eye is sort of looking down, one eye is looking up, it falls short of that likeness that we're trying to achieve. So there's a lot of technicality in the eyes. The eyes make the mount. if the eyes are wrong, you can get called out by other taxidermists. I've made that mistake before and I never make it again. And I like to tell people about the mistakes that I've made, because they're things that you sort of think, well, I'll just do that and no one will notice. But actually people will notice, because people love animals. They just love their animals, and people know animals, especially birds. You know, you're a perfect example. You might see a piece of taxidermy in a museum and say, hang on a minute, those eyes don't seem right. And if you're competing as a taxidermist, you can't afford to make a mistake like that.
Exactly. There's a few questions in the chat, and what I intend to do is take them or have them at the end in the Q&A bit, if that's okay with you guys. But that said, there's a question I was going to ask you next, which actually has been asked in a similar way by Chris Eck just now, Chris Eck, sorry, which is in terms of a challenge. I mean, what's the most, my question was, what's the most challenging species you've done? But I presume it's probably maybe the same as what the most challenging commission was. But what was it?
So I find I'm challenged by the same bird every damn week, and that is an owl. So owls, for those that know, they're just smoke and mirrors. The body of an owl is absolutely tiny in comparison to how many feathers they have. It's just an illusion. So getting those feathers correct, my goodness, it's a challenge. I love them. I think they're beautiful. They've got such emotive faces, and people love owls. But like I said earlier, they're very unique. They have very different sort of mannerisms, and there's so many things about owls that make them owls that don't make them another species. Do you know what I mean? They're really hard to get right. And also because they have discs for faces, and you know, they've got vents for ears that are slightly higher than where normal birds' ears would be. It's so many different, I use the word nuances, you have to revise and learn and understand. Also their eyes are very difficult because they have these huge orbits. And normally with a taxidermy bird, you would take the whole eye out and you would dispose of it because it would rot. But with the owls, you keep the sclera, which is the kind of bone cartilage sort of ring that the pupil sits inside. So you drain out the pupil and then you keep the sclera, and that way you can fill that with clay and sit the eye on that, which you wouldn't do for another bird. So they have all these unique mannerisms that make it really challenging to really understand the species. But it's worth it because they're hard, but they look amazing when they're done.
Yeah, draining eyes doesn't sound very appealing to me, but anyway.
Sorry.
Well, another question that I'd like to ask you is to do with you as a taxidermist, as a woman. I mean, when I think of taxidermist, I'm sure many of the Zoomers here might think the same. You think of a guy, middle-aged, old guy in a white lab coat, you know, with a beard and a bit of a belly, you know, tucked away in a dark place in a museum somewhere. And then you look at you and you think, I mean, if you told me, if I didn't know you, I'd never in a million years think you were a taxidermist. So how are you perceived in the industry? Is it male dominated? Has it changed? Has it become more modern and funky? What's the deal with the world?
Yes, so it is primarily male dominated. However, in the years that I've been practicing, I have definitely seen that shift absolutely in such a mammoth way. And now most of my sort of contemporaries are all female, which is wonderful. I think that it has been a bit of a thorn in my side for the years that I've been practicing, because a lot of the time, for example, when I've been fortunate enough to do any kind of media, they concentrate on the fact that I'm a woman and they don't concentrate on the work, which I find frustrating because we're all taxidermists, and I would like for my work to be the thing that we talk about, because I'm working so hard to do it. I'm born a woman. I can't, you know, that's a fact. But the work I spend so long tirelessly working alone, and they don't even talk about that. I find that very frustrating. I almost don't think that my gender is relevant to my work at all. But however, having said that, it is wonderful that so many women are feeling that they can join the industry, and it's making it obviously a lot more diverse and inclusive. So I only commend that. And I'm excited as well, because I think women are seeing that they can do things that maybe once they couldn't, carving out new roles for themselves. So it's exciting, just science generally, to have all, you know, an advancement of women joining the profession, mine and other scientific roles. So yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a bittersweet thing. And it's hard as well, because I understand why people want to talk about it, but at the same time, you know, taxidermy isn't really about the taxidermist. It's about the animals. We're all doing it for the love of the animals, and if they're not even the thing that's being taken as, you know, talked about, how frustrating is that? You know, we've spent hours trying to recreate these little things. So it's hard. It's something that I feel I will be challenged on continuously. A lot of people, I get trolled on my Instagram, and it's something that people sort of use against me a lot. It seems to be the common thing that gets brought up a lot. And I think maybe it's just because these people are not progressive. These people, these trolls, don't want to see women join the industry. Maybe they want it to stay an old boys club. I don't know. But it's I have to say, it's nice because there's so much integration between the men and women. It's not as though it's men v women. There is integration. So at least that's something that's positive.
Yeah, one word on trolls: they're subhumans, and they are very inadequate as whatever they are. So, you know,
it's okay. I got it. I can handle it.
I know, but I think I get really angry about stuff like that, because I just find, you know, that these people are so quick to point fingers and to try and pull down. But then I often say to people, because they ask me about being trolled or what have you, and I say, well, you know, if someone's sort of making a comment, a negative comment about something that I've done, I ask myself, who are you? And what have you done in your life? And if it's nobody and nothing, then I just move on. And that's 99% of the time, 99.9% of the time, that's what you're going to be getting, isn't it?
I think the thing I find the hardest about the trolling is that they are assuming that I'm motivated by brutality. They're seeing taxidermy or dead animals, and they're thinking that I've personally made an act of terror in order to obtain these species, which, if you actually think about it, is ridiculous. But because I work so hard, you know, I'm passionate about conservation, I love animals, I'm a total bird nerd, and I shout it from the rooftops. That is really frustrating, because it's just not, it just couldn't be more wildly inaccurate. And that I find more frustrating, is that they haven't even taken the time to think, okay, dead animals, why is she working on these? Let me perhaps read up on that strange phenomenon. Rather, they just think straight away, or murderer, or poacher, and it's just not true.
I think they're watching too many Frankenstein movies, really. It must be. We spoke about women. What about ethnic diversity? What about that? Is there an ethnic diversity within the taxidermy world, or is it predominantly white?
Unfortunately, there isn't a great amount of diversity. We're seeing more now in literal recent months than ever before, but it isn't very diverse, admittedly, and it's something that myself and some of my peers and my sort of colleagues, if you can call them that, are working really hard to try to change. I think one of the reasons for this is that getting into taxidermy comes out of education, comes out of privilege. So, you know, being a taxidermist, perhaps you might have needed to study chemistry or biology, or perhaps you've got, like myself, have been fortunate enough to go to university and do a sculpture degree. And a lot of underprivileged people are not going to be able to have these same introductions, so they don't have the resources. It's very easy for me to, you know, walk out of university with a fine art degree, and there we go. So I think it's really important that we make resources available so that people can become involved, and also make these resources free, because, you know, education is so important. And it's not just about physically giving people the education to become a taxidermist, but it's also getting them to be interested in the natural world and in birding and all these other things that are crucial to your mental health and your well-being and your life. It makes your life worth living. And people who live in perhaps very built up areas, who don't have the freedom to walk out and see green, it's bringing nature indoors for these people. So yeah, we are trying as a sort of young progressive ambassadors for the industry to make it more inclusive, but regrettably at the moment, we're just not there yet.
Okay, you can probably hear the bells ringing, which means it's time to ask you that question. What is your favorite bird?
My favorite bird is a splendid fairy wren.
Oh, the Australian.
It's a tiny little, it's a wren, but it's bright electric blue with a dash of turquoise. It's the most beautiful thing. And if I was lucky enough to see one, I don't know what I'd do. I'd probably combust.
Yeah, because I was about to say, you must have gone to Australia to see, but obviously not. Well, yeah, yeah. The fairy wrens. Is it what's it called again? The
Splendid.
splendid fairy wren. Fairy.
Yeah, but it's also called.
Wren, yeah.
It's also called a blue wren, the one that I like. So,
Yeah.
but that's not as exciting.
Beautiful. And if you could be anywhere, notwithstanding this current and awful pandemic, where would you be right now?
Right now, I would love to be in Costa Rica. It's my absolute bucket list location. I'm sure you could tell me all about it because I imagine you might have been. Saving the pennies. I've got a Costa Rica jar.
Well, I was just about to say Costa Rica is one of our most frequently mentioned destinations by guests. So
Doesn't surprise me. That doesn't surprise me.
I haven't been. I've been invited 5 times, but I've never been yet. So
What?
so there you go. Okay, well, Zoomers, we have more interviews coming up over the next few weeks. We're just getting them confirmed. Just slowing them down a little bit because I think before Christmas we're doing 3 or 4 a week, which is quite a lot. So we're going to maybe do 1 or 2 a week. So it's much more of a special thing to look forward to every week. So they're coming up. So keep an eye on my website and also on the social media platforms for when I start announcing guests. We've got some people lined up. We're just chatting them up at the moment. The bells are ringing. Elle, I really appreciate you coming today and tonight, whatever, and this afternoon for some people in America, for coming here and talking to us about taxidermy. It's been really fascinating. I'm sure we've all learned a lot. I, for sure, will not be a taxidermist, but I appreciate you and what you do even more. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before we go, by the way, I must say to everyone, look after yourself, including you, Elle, and keep looking up.